Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Kirby Superstar Ultra. In the last one we started off the game and now it's time for Dyna Blade. They've disrupted the crops, but there must be a reason. But first, this has to stop. Dyna Blade is kind of a weirdly redundant mini-campaign in my eyes, although it does weirdly start with this room, which is a direct reference, I think, to the first screen in Mario Brothers USA. Kinda weird, but oh well. The reason I call the Dyna Blade campaign kinda redundant is that it fulfills a lot of the same ideas as Spring Breeze. It's a very short, very easy, 5-ish level campaign with a very direct goal. In fact, it's even more straight to the point than Spring Breeze, because Spring Breeze has a boss in every level. Dyna Blade only has the one real boss. All the other end-of-level bosses here are just mini-boss variants like Bonkers and stuff, as we see throughout. And part of this could be because of what I brought up last part, where Spring Breeze was originally not going to have copy abilities, as well as, probably due to that, helpers, barring maybe just plugging a second controller in. The addition of copy abilities to that probably meant that this section, which was meant to be a tutorial for how to use them, just ended up being kind of left by the wayside, so we got two very similar campaigns. Is it good? Yes, it's still honestly a very good campaign. In fact, I actually prefer this to Spring Breeze because I think the pace is more consistent, and the levels have a bit more meat to them. But there is still that weirdness to it. Although, as well, they may have, looking back, added the copy abilities and helpers into Spring Breeze because multiplayer was meant to be kind of a thing in the game from the start. One of Sakurai's earliest ideas for the game was to have the multiplayer aspect as well as the omnibus multi-mini campaign format. In fact, the simultaneous co-op thing the game has was a direct request to Sakurai from Miyamoto, because Miyamoto didn't figure Mario at the time could really support the simultaneous co-op, so a more slower-paced series like Kirby could work well with it. And it ultimately does. I think any of the Kirby games that have multiplayer are more playable in multiplayer than any of the Mario games in multiplayer, only because the pacing and camera is a little more helpful, but that's a little different topic entirely. Notably, Dyna Blade's also the only campaign in Superstar and Superstar Ultra that has a version of the classic goal game. The way that works, there's a meter on the top left when you're in the cannon. You want to get it as full as possible to go as far as you can. The further you get more 1-ups. Now, notably, there's a couple of copy abilities I don't show off throughout the game. There's one key one, especially in the 5th campaign. I'll talk about when we get there. But one of them was actually a few moments ago. The Chef Kawasaki mini-boss I fought at the end of the previous stage. That gives you the Chef ability. That will turn Kirby into a chef, and when you hit the attack button, you get a 1-up attack that drags all enemies into a pot and they get cooked into food. Not super useful, but it could be good if you're in a pinch. But we want to enter that door using Beam because this is also the only campaign that has switches straight out of Kirby's Adventure on the NES/Nightmare in Dreamland. 2 stages in Dyna Blade have them, and they take you to very useful secrets, albeit not very in-depth secrets. It's not like secret stages or anything like some games would have. It's just a little vault of sorts. I should note, by the way, throughout this LP, I do not use copy abilities equally. There are several that just don't get to show off all their moves, like Yo-Yo throughout. I tend to stick with about 4 or 5 different ones. Beam, Sword, Hammer, Plasma, although I try to save that for mostly towards the end game, just so I don't get too stale. Cutter as well. I like the ones that have a lot of range, or if they have a close range option, is usually an instant kill on most enemy types. Because enemies in this game don't have, like, a one-and-done hit point like they did in, like, Dreamland 1 or a lot of the games prior to this, or even Dreamland 3. Generally, the larger an enemy is, the more HP it has. Like, there's this weird little bear enemy that wears a bandana. I forget if we've seen one already or not. Like, they are a larger enemy type, so they take like 3 hits-ish. On top of that, different attacks, as we've seen on boss fights, do different damage from the power-ups. So you need to be a little careful what you do. This is Wheel. Wheel is weird in this game. I don't think it moves as fast as it does in like the GBA games to start, but if you mash left and right, Kirby bounces left and right, and when you do that, he actively does go faster. But on top of that, what makes Wheel not as useful, it's not in as many areas. What makes Wheel useful in like Amazing Mirror or Nightmare in Dreamland is that if you get it in one level, you can carry it through to the next levels. And while you can carry power-ups and copy abilities between levels in a mini-campaign, you can't carry them from a mini-campaign to a mini-campaign. You always have to start fresh. And because of that, some of them just don't get nearly as much use as they did in prior ones. Now, I don't show it off here, but having a wheelie as your helper is honestly really recommended because you can actively jump on a wheelie helper to enter what's known as the wheelie rider state, where you can fire stars, I think, if you're playing 2-player for one thing. But it also gives you a much faster movement option than normal Wheel does. We'll see that a couple times down the road. Before we go into the secret level we unlocked with the Switch, this is Iron Mam. It's a mini-boss. Slams down, you can fire the stars it throws at you out at it. As you can see, as usual for Kirby. In the case you don't have a power-up, just shooting the stars that pop out of the enemy's attacks is still a very good option. I'm not sure if I've ever done a copy ability-less playthrough of this game, though. I've mostly done that for ones I grew up with, because I didn't really grow up with Superstar. Alright, this here is what we unlock with the Switch. This is a power-up vault. You can access about half of the game's copy abilities in this room alone. The other half are in a similar vault that you unlock after beating the 4th stage and finding its Switch. If anything, on a first playthrough, I'd recommend spending some time in there to mess around with the various copy abilities to learn which ones you really like. I personally, for instance, like the hammer one, not only because of its high damage, but because it has a jump swing that circles around Kirby, giving me pretty good mobility in the air while also doing damage. It's the same reason why I really like those few attacks that Zero has in the Mega Man X games and his own tetralogy even, where he just spins around in a circle. It does really good damage and allows me to keep the flow going. Now, going back to what I said a few moments ago, my history with Kirby Superstar, I actually started here on Superstar Ultra on the DS. We didn't have the Super Nintendo version growing up, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But I remember being excited from this from the marketing. I think I saw it in Nintendo Power and magazines and all that, and I was just excited, because this was really my peak era for playing Kirby games between Nightmare and Dreamland into the early DS stuff with Squeaks 1 and Canvas Curse and this. After this, like, I didn't play Mass Attack at launch, and if I played future Kirby games, it is after their launch period by a large margin. Now, the reason I say talk about Kirby Superstar on Super Nintendo in a moment is it did well overall, but if I recall in the States, it didn't have the largest print run, which would explain probably why my family didn't have it growing up. Although, helping that probably is that it's in, like, I think the last 40 SNES games released here in the States officially, whereas the immediate follow-up to this game, Kirby's Dream Land 3, was the third to last Super Nintendo game released here in the States, and had an even lower print run. By this point, Nintendo, especially here in the States, was heavily focusing and pushing on the N64, so they just were shifting focus, and at this point as well, the PlayStation, I think, was already out by this point, so gaming was kind of going through a shift. Although I won't lie, there's always been a part of me that finds late Super Nintendo games just vastly interesting to research, especially how many of them just didn't make it here to the States. Be it those Fire Emblems or Mega Man and Bass on Super Nintendo. What they could do with late Super Nintendo I find very interesting. But yeah, basically every late DS Kirby game besides Mass Attack. I have a lot of memories of playing specifically at my grandmother's house for some reason. Just like with Mega Man ZX Advent, that's probably because the DS was my major thing I played during the late 2000s to begin with. Like, if I wasn't playing on that, I was playing on the Wii, or just going to my basement and playing old stuff at that point, quote-unquote old stuff, on my PS2 or GameCube. It is often kind of weird now, looking back at the mid to late 2000s, seeing where I was then with games to where I am now, because I was already pretty varied with what I did now, but now the games I play are even more all over the place. Oh, also, I guess probably should address this directly. Kirby can fly, of course, and that does mean you can avoid a lot of challenges. But this game does a good job down the line of not making the areas more cramped, because that's more of a Dreamland 3 thing. But it makes so you have more plentiful ceilings at the least, so you can't outright avoid every challenge by flying over it. I'd say, in general, Dyna Blade's the last stage you can, the last mini-campaign, rather, where you can avoid, like, 90% of things just by flying up. And it comes back a little bit towards the end, but there's other things to worry about at that point. Although, I do also want to give Kirby Superstar some credit for this, and we'll see this more as we go through. The mini-campaigns have a really smooth difficulty curve that only really jumps up at the very end, and even then, that very end is only in Superstar Ultra. And they even directly lampshade and tell you this information, because on it's the top screen on the DS, but when we're on the little bulletin board screen, it's the screen on the bottom right down there. There's even a little star ranking of like 1 through, I want to say max is 8 or 9 stars. And because of that, you can find a very easy difficulty curve just using that. And I appreciate that clarity of information, because I imagine if it didn't have that, it wouldn't be hard, but it definitely would make the game feel a lot more inconsistent is the word that's coming to mind, but I don't think it's the one I'm looking for here. So we'll just stick with inconsistent, because it's not like, say, a Mega Man game, where each of the 8 levels you have to select usually are about the same difficulty. It's just a matter of how you adapt to the platforming challenges in that specific level's mechanics that might make it a little different. If you, say, went right from Spring Breeze over to Great Cave Offensive, you would notice that difficulty jump. Whereas going from Spring Breeze into Dyna Blade or Gourmet Race, and then over to Great Cave Offensive, that difficulty jump isn't as noticeable. And I appreciate games that have clear difficulty curves like that, and then aren't just like, suddenly we're gonna be like this difficulty for a little bit, but then we're gonna lower for a little bit, but then heighten like twice up the original, and then go back down again. I'm directly looking at the bosses from Mario 3 as I'm saying this. Alright, so this here is, I think, the first time I've seen one of these. This is a cannon and a fuse. Fuses can only be lit by fire-type attacks. Thankfully, Hammer has one of those, but the fire ability will do just the same as well. I want to say there's like 1 or 2 others that can also trigger that, but you seldom need to actually use the cannons, unless you're going for 100%. In which case, you will need to use them at least from memory 4 times throughout, like twice in the 4th campaign, once in the 5th. I don't think it's in the 6th campaign at all. And because of the being in the 4th and 5th, you might also need to use them in the, I forget if it's the 7th campaign or the 8th. There's a lot of campaigns in this game. I'd say overall, Kirby Superstar, because of all the mini campaigns, is probably one of the longest Kirby games on record. The only ones that maybe compete with it are more or less actually all the games that use these combat mechanics moving forward, like Return to Dreamland, Triple Deluxe, Robobop, all those. But out of like the classic Kirby games, the one that really rivals in length is probably Kirby 64, and even then, that's just because some of those levels are very long on their own. It does make me think, though, I feel like Kirby could be a series that could really well adjust to an RPG entry, kind of like how Mario has had Mario and Luigi and Paper Mario for so long. Because you even have, like, general character classes to start, like Kirby would be a Mimic type that maybe could use any of the abilities, but not as well. Meta-Knight would be like a sword character or a fighter. DDD could be a Berserker type. Waddle Dee would be a Dragoon. There's some interesting stuff you could do there, but whether or not we'll actually see that happen, I don't know. It feels like out of any of the Nintendo franchises, though, we're most likely to see Kirby try that out before any of the others go back to it again. Only because Kirby has such a wide range in franchises to begin with. Like, it's got 2 racing games now, thanks to the little rolling gourmet thing on Switch I didn't play. It's got, like, 2 technical fighting games? Not even counting Smash Brothers. It's got a Metroid and a half. An RPG could fit in just well. Mind you, I'm of the mindset that a series could do a lot of things in a spin-off. To begin with, like, I'd like to see a Metroid RPG at some point as well, or at least like a Final Fantasy Tactics-style tactical RPG. That could be cool. Either way, the switch we pressed in that previous stage accessed us the second of the copyability vaults. And there's a weird one in here that I used, I believe, in the last stage, known as Copy. Copy is a one-use ability that scans enemies in front of you and copies whatever ability it is. It does technically have a purpose, but it's very limited and it's only in one campaign. We'll talk more about that when we get there. For now, though, it's time for us to head after Dyna Blade themselves. Dyna Blade can be kind of a hectic boss fight, but I've selected Jet and Hammer here because they do a lot of damage. Dyna Blade can stretch their neck out to try and hit you with it directly. It can swipe across the screen in a couple different varieties, and if it grabs you, it's going to just grab you and hold on to you for a bit, doing a lot of damage. The big attack of note is it'll eventually, I believe, fly up and try to sweep down into you, sort of like Harpuya does, or would rather, after this, in Mega Man 2. But if you're good about using high damage abilities or avoiding the attacks, they'll go down pretty quickly, or you could just get bonked on the head and die. Superstar is probably one of the easier Kirby games to die in out of the classic ones, only because the game does have more difficulty than, say, the main Dreamland trilogy or Nightmare Dreamland. But enough effort and they go down pretty quickly. That's Dyna Blade. It's cute, but like I said, it does feel a little redundant with Spring Breeze already in the game, but I think it is a better introduction to the game's mechanics overall. It doesn't have a lot of staying power, but it's fun. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 3, we go into the Great Cave. See you guys then.